let's get started. We're almost 3 months into the pandemic, and some of the lockdown requirements are finally beginning to be relaxed. Here in Ontario, where I'm situated, we're able to have get-togethers of up to 10 people, and that's really quite exciting. And we're seeing some services being reopened. I know personally, I cannot wait for the hairdressers to come back because, I mean, it's time. It's absolutely time. And I know I'm not alone on that one. There are so many things that we've all had to put off and shift our thinking on over the past few months. And with restrictions lifting, we have a choice on how we decide to reconstruct our lives and our expectations. The reality is the lockdown has created an absence of human activity in many of our major cities. And as a result, we've seen some remarkable things happening, right? I'm sure you've all been reading about it, from wildlife showing up in the streets, to the oceans beginning to recover, to emissions levels being the lowest in decades. And we're seeing from that smog clearing in some of the largest and most congested cities in the world. So what can each of us do to continue some of these amazing shifts while still creating the lives we enjoy? How can each of us contribute to a future that we actually all agree upon? One where we leave a less heavy footprint on this beautiful earth that we live on. Well, that's the question that I'm posing to my guest today. Nikolas Badminton is a world-renowned futurist, researcher, keynote speaker, and media producer. He shares an awe-inspiring vision based upon the trends that are shaping our future. Nick leads Exponential Minds, an expert advisory company that helps trillion-dollar companies, progressive governments, and media shift their mindset from what is to what if. Nick is joining us from the Exponential Minds at Startwell headquarters right here in our great city of Toronto. Nick, that's a great promise, and I'm hoping you can help me and our guests today make that mindset shift. That's such a hard word to say, mindset shift, because I know that what is a little bit unclear at this moment, and I know that I need your help, and I'm sure our guests do, with the what if, because that's the big question right now. So Nick, help us out here.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and it's really good to be chatting to everyone online. Hello to people all over the world, all over Canada, and it's some of the people I know that are online. So hi, it's good to see you, and I look forward to connecting with you. And this has been certainly an interesting few weeks. The last 3 months, literally been stuck, in my home office working, and now I'm working here at Startwell in my event space and working with a number of clients. And it's been a busy few weeks, and I've been working with very large tech players and governments to try and work out what happens beyond the pandemic, because this should not define our strategic thinking. We should start using foresight to see a little further into the future. And this very short sort of insight that I'm going to give you today is about the brave new world, our opportunity to really move our mindsets from what is, what we see today, what we deal with every day, the short-term planning, like 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, even 18 months, to ask ourselves, what if? Use creative thinking, look out 5, 10, 20 years, create the worlds that could exist with our involvement, and then bring that back to our strategic thinking. But when I start my conversations, I always generally talk about the Industrial Revolution. We're about 260, 270 years into that. And now we're very firmly in the grips of what's often called the fourth Industrial Revolution. So digitized communications and biology, renewable energy, automated transportation and logistics. And you've probably seen all of these things accelerating at these times. But really, we're seeing an absolute failure of the industrial complex. So we almost need to break free from that idea of industry and start switching our thinking towards humanity. Really, it's taken a pandemic to see a number of things that have been hugely challenging, to see the crash of oil, the effect of legacy transportation solutions, the reduction of pollution, and now the rebound, to see the failure in our food supply system, to see underfunding of basic medical care and essential services, to see how poorly we've treated our elders in the community. And we've put that into stark relief with the amount of deaths that we've seen around the world, to see the exposure of vulnerable, underrepresented and marginalized people in communities all over the world, how markets have rebounded with no sense and the shareholders having the power. You know, lots of money's been poured into industries that maybe should really die on the vine because they're not working so well. And we're seeing that globalization truly isn't existing in the way that we really want. The cooperation isn't there. There's a lot of tension in the world, and there's going to be huge transformation in that area. And the biggest thing, and as a foresight practitioner, as a futurist, it's really challenging for me to see this, is the fact that we had no idea of how to deal with a pandemic event. And we've been seeing pandemics through history. I mean, a lot of people have been talking about the Spanish flu, the Hong Kong flu, but really 2002 with SARS, 2012 with MERS, we've had Ebola kick in. So once in a decade pandemics aren't really going to be that unlikely going forward. And maybe this is really helping people step up and think, okay, we need to do some planning, we need to prepare. This is going to happen again. And really what I call this failure of recognition of the pandemic that has wrought its power on the world is that it's a black elephant. A lot of people talk about black swans and black swan events. These are things that come from nowhere, completely unexpected. We've expected this. We've just ignored it. It's a black elephant. Another black elephant is climate change, and that's incredibly challenging to talk about it. And people are literally ignoring that. Also something else, big pharma crises, the opioid crises, things like insulin skyrocketing in price, and that basic sort of need for people with diabetes. Just we're ignoring that it's essential. We're ignoring that it should be priced sensibly. Deaths are going to happen around the world. But really, we've got a huge opportunity to address some of these big black elephants that come careering into the room and break everything up and make our lives very painful, as they have been over the last 3 months for many people. So there are opportunities to really scale up our commitment to humanity, to challenge the industrial complex, to break it, and to come back into new ways of thinking around energy and electrification, global supergrids, electric vehicles, biofuels, urban design and smart cities, giving the cities back to the people rather than designing them around road systems. We've seen incredible projects in Paris and Barcelona and a number of places, and those conversations are ongoing. Banking and finance, open banking, digitalization, cryptocurrencies, big tech players becoming banks, which I think is going to be a trend going forward. What happens when you have a world player like Amazon try and challenge the US dollar? And then, you know, the future of work. We've heard everything from remote working and virtual keynotes and meetings, and people are probably fed up of staring into their webcams and their rectangles and listening into their phones. But, you know, hybridized ways of working, new ways to collaborate, new ways to be creative, new ways to ask the question, what if? And, you know, more in education, medicine, transportation, and otherwise. So we've got an opportunity to really focus back onto what we had to do, which is create solutions for humans to thrive and to have abundance without having a few people in the world controlling massive industries and that industrial complex steamrolling ahead. And now we've been put into this world where we've got a world of exposure. So biology and computing and data are accelerating faster than ever before. And it's created exponential exposure. One of my great friends, Patrick, who's actually on this call, calls some of this the war on one. We've now got borderless exposure to all of the challenges in the world, and every citizen that dares to step into the world and goes about their daily business is at risk of being corrupted through cybercrime and a whole bunch of other mechanisms as well. And that translates back into community risk and back up into country risk and then back up into global risk as well. But where do we go next? Well, I think we need to refocus back onto humanity, create the idea of equality, and we've certainly seen a lot of those conversations right now, and equity, which is ownership of solutions and ownership of the place in the world, and equality and equity need to play together. And we really need to equalize the world, whether that's from a wealth perspective, a rights perspective, you know, giving everyone a voice. And really, the second part of this is about creating a progressive society, governments, society, business markets, by using a new approach where we can create a bionic society in a way where we invest in behavioral capital and cognitive capital and network capital. Sometimes they call this beacon capital across all of these dimensions of communications, biology, transportation, and energy. And as a futurist, and I've been working with clients and really working on some of the world's biggest challenges that are facing them right now. I've been educating them about foresight and what we can do, how we can use that ability to look forward and speculate, to ask, what if the world changes across different dimensions, to create an equitable world, to help them really design what a brave new world looks like. You know, planning preferable, possible, and plausible futures, even asking what's truly preposterous and how that could come back into what could be a dystopian reality. Looking at science fiction, writing science fiction, and creating those scenarios of the future. It's a fun activity, but incredibly inspirational to bring it back to strengthen strategic thinking, identify risks way before they could happen. And that's proven to have a huge amount of value for companies that do invest in that kind of work. And we're going to see a trend of more futurist and foresight practitioners working within large and small organizations to help them really get that advantage today, because no one really is starting to look at the world in an 18-month cycle or a 3-month cycle anymore. People like Elon Musk didn't start off by thinking that he was going to make SpaceX and Tesla happen in a couple of years. It's taken well over a decade to get to the point where we can have privatized space travel up to the International Space Station. That was a great moment a couple of weeks ago. But what I do with foresight, and this comes back to the humanity piece, is apply some key principles here. Humanity, not technology. Don't come with the solution first. Start with humanity and what we really need, human-centered design. Plurality, inclusion, and equity. You know, we have to treat everyone equal. We have to be aware of our privilege, and we have to step forward to ensure that that privilege is shared by everyone, and everyone is given a right to step forward when maybe they haven't had that opportunity. And I'm driven by scientific fact and creativity around that. Science evolves and it gets stronger, and our insights develop over time. And I think that that's some of the most important things that we need to think about as we step forward into this brave new world, as we put humanity at the center of our focus. And as we step forward as futurists and people that think about the future, to help create a world that's interesting, exciting, progressive, and also a platform for everyone in the world to thrive.
Nick, that was fantastic. You just took us from, from the beginning of, the industrial revolutions all the way into the future. And that was a lot in about 10 minutes. So I am sure that many of our guests right now, their brains are maybe still trying to, oh, sorry. I think my microphone muted there by mistake. Yeah. So I want to actually throw it out to the guests, first of all, to say, join us in the questions, because I know you have some. Nick just gave us that very high top line, and I'm sure you want to deep dive. So there's the Q&A button below, or the chat. Drop your questions in, and this is a great opportunity to talk to a futurist, so don't miss it. Nick, I started off talking a little bit about some of the changes that we're seeing in our planet as a result of, the lack of human activity. And, as a futurist, and you look out, look, climate change it wasn't a surprise, to your point. It was a black elephant. We all knew it was coming. But we're seeing that the Earth has it has its own innate way of repairing itself, interestingly enough, when humans step away. So, from your perspective, as you look at what has happened, what can we do better? What can we do that helps us stay in this better place? Like from a futurist standpoint, or perhaps, what can you predict that we'll do? because maybe that's the better place to go. So I'll leave it to you. But I think climate change is really the question, to say, how can we come back from the COVID-19 pandemic in a more responsible way that helps us all have that lighter footprint that I mentioned earlier?
Yeah, and this is the challenge, and you know, the big black elephant in the room
Yeah,
is
of course.
climate change more than anything else. Yeah, the idea, you know, nature is healing. This mimetic sort of thing has been flying around, and you know, we've seen animals and ducks and goats and whatever taking back to the streets and rewilding. I saw an amazing picture of Dubai yesterday, and the desert has
Yeah.
taken over the roads again. I actually shared with a client of mine some of the information around how places around like Wuhan and also California and LA, and it's cleaner than ever before, whatever. But you know, we haven't fixed anything. It's just been a pause. Everyone's calling this a great pause. And what's happening now is that people are just going back to their old habits. We are locked into this industrial complex, and it's going to take us a while to get out of it. We've already got a lot of the good thinking: electrification, super grid, solar and wind, and electric vehicles. I drive an electric vehicle, and a number of different technologies that can really help us get into the new world. Biofuels as well for industrial transportation, and that's been used from everything from flying through to tankers out there on the ocean as well. Interesting stat, yesterday, TSA reported 500,000 Americans flew yesterday. So we are slowly creeping back into those habits. So climate change is super real. We have to be really honest. I think what's happened as part of the pandemic is that the absolute depth of corruption and struggle within the oil and gas and fossil fuel industry, and how few people influence that, it's come to light. I think that more banks and more governments are stepping away from the investment in these areas. The lobbyists that have been so powerful and spending hundreds of millions of dollars to influence the markets to keep oil as a core currency of the world are going to have a hard time, and that's good. Yeah. Now is the time for the rising of renewable energy. Now is the time for us to really recognize that climate change is super real. And the next 15 to 20 years is going to be essential for shifting investment and shifting the opportunity of access to energy that's very, very cheap and globally traded in a way that really empowers everyone, versus, you know, using it as kind of a, you know, it's been used as a prize, and it's been used as something that's a bartering tool. Energy is no longer going to come from the ground. Energy is not going to have an inherent value. The utilities are, and the sharing of that. So that's going to be a new economy there. And that's going to be really grounded in good principles around ensuring that our climate begins to heal and that we don't warm the planet anymore.
Right. Thank you. That, you know, I think that's such an important message for all, especially Canadians, to hear. You know, we do have, of course, a thriving economy, or maybe not so thriving economy in the oil and gas industry. And I think that there are so many other ways that, you know, that we can look to fuels. And so there's a lot of opportunity there for us as Canadians to really think about, you know, and for those businesses to take a deeper look at, because certainly we are leading the world in the area of renewables, and looking at some of the different technologies that are coming out of clean tech. I've got a bunch of questions from the audience, so I knew that I would. So let's just start from the top. So Thomas is asking us if the sharing economy is at risk due to the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the implications of it. I think it's a great question. So Nick, I'm curious to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, I've worked in the sharing economy, and I've used the sharing economy. I used to run North America and the media and PR for freelancer.com, full disclosure. I still use these platforms. I can still connect with people across the world to do everything from like voiceover work to building websites to creating images for me in a way that's really, really cheap, and it sort of spreads the wealth that I can put out in terms of business investment in the world. I think that it's a huge opportunity to have these platforms explode in terms of usage. I don't think the sharing economy has been challenged from that services perspective. Where it has been challenged is when you look at like the ride sharing companies or the on-demand home rental companies. That's been really epically shaken to the core, and big questions have been asked around validity, what markets it should be in, how that works, how it supports the communities in reality. So I think that, you know, the services side is going to be rocking. I think the provision of transportation and homes and offices is really going to be challenging to recover in the same way. But, you know, we all still like to use things like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft and whatever. And so we are going to bounce back into using that. I just think that now those companies, you know, are really looking at the world in a different way and asking themselves, what strategic ways can we work with cities to really enable, you know, people to get the job done that they need to get done.
So I want to make sure I'm hearing that. So like, I'm starting to hear an element of two things. One, which is community, and two, which is values, and sort of the community values aspect. And I think we've certainly all seen that as we've been isolated and locked down, you know, missing, of course, our friends and family, but even equally as important, the communities within which we live. And I think that if there's one thing the COVID-19 pandemic has done for us, is it's really showed us that we are more interconnected than we ever realized. And certainly the sharing economy was one aspect of that, but not the only aspect. So I think I'm hearing that right. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm going to read this one. It's a little bit complex. So can you speak to broadening? And this is from Peter. Petri. Can you speak to the broadening the perspective of human-centered design to environmental and broader perspectives, to the self and to the many?
It's a big question. To the self and to the many in human-centered. Yeah. That's incredibly smart questions.
It is.
When we go back to the principles of human-centered design, we actually look at the desires and needs of humans and society that they live in the communities they live in, within particular contexts that are important. It might be a banking context, it might be transportation, it might be, I don't know, it could be travel. And when we do that, you do need to go to the lowest common denominator, which is the self. This is why when you do really productive design thinking exercises, you have lots of different people in the room. And what's interesting is I really encourage my clients to listen to children and the elders as well, because the insights from those people are incredible. I was once at a conference, and it was an innovation conference. I asked people in the room to put their hands up if they ever brought children or elders into the room. And it was about 300 people, and one woman put her hand up. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I said, that's a bit disappointing, but good for you. And anyway, I said, can I ask you who you work with? She goes, I work with indigenous populations. We know that the youth has answers, we know that elders has answers, and we know that the entire community have answers as well. So that just typified to me the kind of collaboration you need from a human-centered design perspective. And a lot of business has forgotten the importance of everyone in this world to be part of that solution.
Yeah, I can't agree more. You know, the two things came to mind as you were talking. First of all, I do want to just reinforce how I actually think our Indigenous communities certainly know way more than those who are in the non-Indigenous communities around human-centered design. I think it has been the way in which they have existed for millennia, really. It has been their core idea. But the second thing that came to mind, and you know, you talk about learning from children, and you know, we do a lot of work with the Knowledge Society, and I know you know of the Knowledge Society, the TKS kids, and you know, certainly I have seen them show up in you know, all around the world. And some of the things that we're now learning from these, you know, incredibly bright, you know, 13, 14, 15-year-olds is incredible, because they look at the world so differently. They're all living in a futurist capacity like you are, but from the lens of, you know, of that 13 or 14-year-old mind. I mean, it's really quite incredible to see how they see the world differently.
Yeah.
So Lewis Rifkin is asking us thoughts on additive manufacturing, particularly at home facilities. This is a great question. Love this one.
Yeah, so 3D printing, additive manufacturing, it comes under a number of different names. I've dabbled in it. I've got a lot of friends that work in this, and we've seen this going into scale with people printing parts for cars and for machinery, and also for planes. And, the idea that you could have an at-home additive manufacturing facility to be able to print the pieces that you need for your home, whether that's out of metal or plastic or whatever. I think that this is still very much a hobbyist's world in terms of home usage. I think that it's still, the technology is particularly tricky for some people, and it's getting better. But I think more so we're going to have community additive manufacturing facilities that groups of homes can go to get things built for them, replicated or whatever. And I think that could be a really positive change in society. So very much as you would go to a library, you might go to a department in the library which is around additive manufacturing that helps you do something at home with a DIY project or something's broken. But I do think that additive manufacturing in terms of prototyping in the wider world and looking at innovation and starting to look at new ways of manufacturing as a whole, it's just going to really go exponentially more important in terms of where it's going to find its place in the world. Yeah. And
Yeah,
thanks, Lewis, for that.
yeah, it's a great question. We do, as many of you know, we do a ton of work with Singularity University, both out of California as well as here in Canada. And I was at, and I'm trying to remember where it was because we do a lot of work with them around the world. But I was at one of the we certify all their faculty, and I was at one of the programs, and one of the faculty who was being trained was in the area of additive manufacturing, and he gave this fantastic example that still stays with me, which he basically took the idea of additive manufacturing and said, look, here's how we can actually start to bring together some of these technologies, because we know, as looking to the future, that it's not any one technology that's going to make the difference. It's actually the culmination of many technologies. And he brought together autonomous vehicles and additive manufacturing and looking at real-time need. And what he said was, if we were to equip we've got a lot of large shipping container type boats that will be rendered useless actually in the not so distant future, because we're not going to be moving things in those large scale ways, and it's already happening. And so you take them and you equip them with additive manufacturing capabilities. And now what you've got is a floating warehouse or a floating manufacturing facility. And now you park it outside of some of the, in the harbor in New York, as an example, or in California, where now print on demand and all of the swag or all of the things that we need can be printed on demand and manufacturing in very large scale with warehousing capabilities. So I think it's so interesting when we look at these technologies, and while we're not there today, that idea is not possible in this moment, but it's possible in the not so distant future. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're just seeing a trial run of all these technologies. We're just working out their use cases and where we're going to get a lot of uptake. Sometimes it takes a while for technology to seep into culture. Paul Sappho very famously said it takes about 30 years for technology to seep into culture. Even if we look at like everything from our mobile phones to the webcams to whatever, and even these platforms that we use to do these sessions, it just takes a long time for people to get used to it, and for suddenly, services to become verbs, right? When you Google something or you Uber somewhere or whatever, right? And eventually we're going to be, printing our way into a future that's going to be very interesting. Printing homes, printing cars, printing toys for our kids. And I think that, everything's been a trial run. I just think we're ripe to just realize what this can look like at scale.
It's an exciting place where we are right now. Peter Miller is asking, will this clear real life example of the direct connection between automobile exhaust and the environment embolden politicians to make laws to restrict the use of non-renewable energy for transportation? Wow. I think that's kind of the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nicholas, I'm
And
curious to hear your thoughts on that.
yeah, thanks, Peter. And you know, I switched to an electric vehicle a couple of years ago, and you know, there's lots of controversy about, you know, what makes the batteries and whatever, and we can get into that if we really want to. I do think that the business case for electrification, having electric transportation, is getting stronger and stronger by the year. We're seeing China double down and go like full infrastructure, electrified infrastructure in its cities, all of its bus infrastructure. I was here in Toronto, I saw a fully electrified bus the other day. It sort of makes my heart sing when I see that. It's just better. The technology is better. There's less that's going to break. And I had my car service the other day, and there's nothing to service. I had the tires changed. I'm a little late to switch to summer tires, and he was like, "Oh yeah." I was going to say, "Do you need an oil change?" No, I don't need an oil change. About once a year, I need to put windscreen washer fluid in. You know, so when you actually look at that and the destruction of an aftermarket that's literally kept us attached to these ICE vehicles, then we're going to move into this electric vehicle future. As that technology gets exponentially cheaper, it's just going to be exponentially adopted by everyone.
Yeah, no question there. No question. I'm just looking at some, we've got a lot of questions. So I'm going to go to another one. And we're ping-ponging a little bit, people.
Yeah.
So thank you. I apologize in advance. We're not sort of bringing it all together, but that's because there's some great questions and I want to make sure we get them all in. So from local to global, are we moving to global, from global to local? This is a great question as well.
Yeah. Yeah, globalization has kind of failed us all. The borders have come up pretty quickly. The transformation of how goods are going to be shipped around the world and where we source materials from, it's going to change, you know. What's really interesting here is that I think the pandemic has shown us the weaknesses in the global supply chain. We've put a huge amount of reliance on pharmaceutical base compound supply from places like China. Something like 75%, 80% of all base compounds come from there. I mean, it's made us wake up. I'm thinking about all sorts of, you know, swag and you know, these sort of fun toys and goods. I mean, bikes have sold out all over North America, and they can't restock them because they all come from China and Taiwan and places like that. You know, we've seen that we are going to go back to local, and it's going to be great. I mean, it might cost a little bit more, but I think that we put into a new perspective the value of the people on our doorsteps as well. And there's a question in here around brick and mortar retail. I think that we're going to see the high street becoming so much more essential to communities than these big box stores and the malls that we've been sort of forced into to try and get what we need. And I just think that that's really heartening. And again, coming back to humanity, I think that creates stronger communities.
Yeah, you know, and as we're saying this, because the thing that comes up in my mind right away as we talk about going from global to local, which I totally agree. And the example that I gave earlier with the additive manufacturing even helps that more, right? Because now you can make it even, you know, larger scale, but local. But the question that I then have is, okay, great. If we're going to go global to local in terms of our resourcing and purchasing habits, do we need to go from local to global in terms of our governance structures? And, you know, that takes us the other way because I think they're related. And I think there's a big argument to be had for how we need to start to, you know, see the lessening of the nation state. Thoughts on that?
You know what, this is the challenge. You know, we see World Economic Forum, United Nations, World Health Organization, all these people trying to bring together countries and from all over the world, from all the continents, to try and have sensible discussions. We have to realize this. The world has been created by war and taxes, and the war continues to perpetuate within the boundary of war and taxes. Whether the war becomes something that's more geopolitical and around a table, or whether it's something that's very real and visceral. And hey, we've seen a lot of activists, we've seen a lot of civil unrest, and we've got a lot of war that's still going on around the world. Let's not forget about that. But, you know, can we get global? Can we share that mindset? Can we collaborate in new ways? I hope so. And what we have to enable that is the death of the ego. We have to heal a lot of the trauma that's out in the world. And it's really tough because people have got legacy. And epigenetics has shown us that we've got legacy through hundreds of generations that have gone before us. So the world's kind of suffering a form of PTSD. We kind of have to heal together. It's incredibly challenging for many, many people in the world to do so. I think the tipping point in the world and the collaboration that's going to happen truly is when we see a diversity coming into world leadership. I mean, we've seen men leaders in the world and the countries that they've helped through this pandemic or sort of put back into the dark ages a little bit. And we've seen the women that have liberated themselves and the countries from the problem of the pandemic really, shaking them to pieces. So I think that there's a big discussion. This is a controversial subject. And when I speak on stage about this, I generally have a queue of people wanting to chat to me afterwards to say, well, you're wrong here, you're right here, I love that, I don't love this. War and taxes, we have to get away from this idea. Can we live in a world without borders where everyone can live together? Might be a utopian dream, and it might not be the absolute ideal future, but we need to refocus what discussion and collaboration looks like. And we certainly need to refocus how wealth, equity, and the distribution of funds that create a better world for all actually works.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to some of your opening remarks around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of that you added the word plurality, which I think is a really important add, because it takes us to a different place, right? And I think, I work with many speakers, and recently was working with one where we were having a discussion on this very thing around diversity being a word that already has inherent judgment in it, and plurality being one where it actually expands and opens that idea. And I think it's a really interesting point. And as you start looking around the world, and as you pointed out, we are starting to see some countries that have more community base. Or, and often, interestingly, that's, female-led countries where the community tends to be stronger. And so, I don't know what the future is. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is going to become a much bigger conversation over the next 12 months. And I am very curious to see what the World Economic Forum has to say in January about this very thing, because I think they've got some pretty strong ideas on where we need to go in order for us to come together,
Absolutely.
I think we have time for about one more question, and I have so many of them here. I'm trying to choose. There was one that's been here for a while that's kind of related to what we're just talking about from Patrick. And he says, our technology has precious metals, silicon, chromium, tungsten, cobalt. These are primarily South Africa and South American. How do we balance the demand for metals and corruption and supply chain vulnerability? This is a great question.
Yeah. I've actually worked with some mining companies to try and open their minds to thinking about new ways of sourcing and ethical sourcing of materials. Back a few years ago, I was working with a company, and I think there was the Congo Minerals Act. I might have the name slightly wrong. Trying to challenge people like Apple and Google and all these other people that are providing devices and everything in the world to provide ethically sourced materials. Yes. We've got South America and Africa as major suppliers. That's going to continue. Up in Canada, we've got supplies of certain things as well. But responsible approaches to mining are going to be essential, because mining is not going to go away. We just need to make sure that we fix the earth after we take what we need from it. If you actually look at some of the statistics, we're not sort of taking too much from the earth already, but some of the practices around how we've done it to date have been awful, and especially if you go down and look at precious metals in Africa, absolutely terrible treatment behavior, wars, blood diamonds. I here in front of me, I've got a laptop, a webcam, I've got a phone here, I've got a wireless keyboard, I've got a mouse. Do I truly know where they've all come from? Well, Apple, Chinese webcam, Chinese, it's very, very hard. Is some of this going to be not ethical in the way that the materials were sourced? Absolutely. Do I feel guilty? Absolutely. What am I doing? I'm trying to start these conversations. I'm trying to take it to world leaders to say, we got to do something very serious about this, and we're going to protect human life. And if we're going to act in this way, and we're going to produce this technology, and this technology is going to thrust us forward, then we're going to do it in a way that's completely different.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think we have time for one last question, and I'm going to go to Enzo. He says, this is another global to local. So at the end of the day, cost price drives everything. How can you generate a thriving local industry when the same part can come from China at a tenth of the cost of the same part locally? So, this is the question that, we're always grappling with, but how do we bring those local costs down? Or do we?
You know what, this for me, this is a conversation around societal inequality in a way. When you have people who can't afford to go to an organic supermarket to buy organic goods, or to go and buy an artisanally made shirt or whatever, and you have people that have to go down to the cheapest possible solution, that's where we've still got this situation of the global supply chain, making things in bulk, shipping it halfway around the world. If you look down to America, there are still a lot of neighborhoods that rely on getting the food that they eat from dollar stores. And if you look at dollar stores in the States, it's one of the only retail sectors that's actually boomed over the past sort of 5 to 10 years. So this is, again, one of these struggles in the world of really dealing with what the core problem is. The core problem is inequality in society. Once we can create that equity and bring people into the ownership of solutions, and we can provide, community gardens and new ways of providing, food in a way, then it's incredibly, empowering to see that we can bring society up from the bottom. And sort of equalize that a little bit. In Valencia, it's really interesting. They've got 1 million people that are fed by an internetwork of farms that have been there for hundreds of years. They've been working in this way. Solutions are out there. We can look to the past to find things that can work for our future. Unfortunately, we've been put into cities. We've been told how to act. We've been given the systems to use. And this is exactly what I'm getting at in terms of the failure of the industrial complex, is that we've forgotten that the people that need to really thrive and benefit from this are the people that the consumers and the providers, and not necessarily the shareholders or the board of directors necessarily.
That's absolutely, there's so many things going through my mind there as you were saying that. Part of it was my little hydroponic garden that I have behind me that's growing lettuces for me and my daughter right now, all the way to thinking about, the impact that certainly the pandemic has had on travel, which will eventually impact also shipping. And so I wonder if, that made in China, 10 cents on the dollar good will continue to be that, because I don't know that that'll be the case in the future, because we have yet to see the economic outcomes from COVID and which industries will be highly affected. So I think there's still so much to be learned, and Nikolas, you have given us so much to think about, and there are still a lot of questions here. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, will you come back and maybe do a Q&A with us? Because this has been fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always available. I always love chatting to you, Andrea, and the team over at Talk Boutique. And it's so great to see so many people that I know in the chat asking so many challenging questions. Thanks very much. It's good. We can be connected in this world, and asking the question, what if the world changes, is going to be the thing that really liberates our thinking, so we can design something that works for humanity.
Fantastic. So we will let everyone know when Nikolas is going to come back. Thank you all for joining us. So we have another virtual speaker series starting up next week with our sense-making conversation on Friday. We have Sandra Elia. On Wednesday, we have our courageous conversations with John Robinson Jr., which we have just begun, and where he will be tackling the hard question of racism and systemic racism in our society. And then our Changemaker 20, and I think we'll have Nikolas coming back for one of our Changemaker 20s. It might be next week. I need to confirm that with him. So thank you all for joining us. You have been an absolute fantastic audience. Your questions have challenged us. They've given us so many things to think about. I am looking forward to seeing you all again next week. Again, I'm Andrea Sampson, CEO of Talk Boutique. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Sense Making Conversations. Take care.